The emphasis here is on where should the concrete go, because as you heard from Peter, there's going to have to be concrete. There's no escape from the need to build to meet those demands. I suppose my presentation is going to be slightly less, I'm not quite sure what the adjective is, slightly less apocalyptic than what you've just heard. I'm going to try and poke down a little bit into a little bit of the last decade's history that Peter's touched on, looking in a bit more detail at what the actual sources of urban capacity are, what this brownfield resource is, and some of the concerns, which again you've touched on, Peter, and then how does policy interact with that in meeting the demand, and then a last little burst on ecotowns, which none of us can resist, of course, the current government initiative. So just to go through how we got here, from really, 10 years ago, we were pretty well building anywhere. It's important to recognize that not only were we building a lot more houses, we were building houses in places that now almost all policy would say was completely inappropriate. And it's important to get that perspective as well as the 60-year Silkengrad perspective, I think, that things have changed an awful lot over that period. So I just wanted to go on a little historical tour. There's Peter in the middle of that Urban Task Force launch, before he was Sir Peter Hall, I note, from the caption. And I'm not there because I'm taking the picture. What's happened since then is a real stress on urban capacity. That was one of the great outputs of that Towards an Urban Renaissance study that came out of Richard Rogers' chairmanship and our participation on that, leading to government policy, the public policy guidance note on housing that stressed that, onto a real debate about density and a lot of wrong routes that Peter has pointed out. People took it that once you didn't have more or less a maximum density, you could build anything at any density. And as Peter's pointed out, there's all sorts of things wrong with that. The brownfield ratio in the new build has gone up by the factor from below 50% in the early 90s to something like, certainly 2/3, some years, nearly 3/4 of the new house building, home building, is on brownfield land. So real achievements there. And then most recently, this change in emphasis to the Barker-induced, if you like, push for the bigger numbers, for some sort of recognition that getting the quality and the location right wasn't all that it was about, that quantity matters too. So within that history, we've got this real effort and real successes in getting urban capacity into place. And it's, I think, useful to think about what this is. It's what the planning trade calls PDL, previously developed land, which is vacant or derelict or underused. And a lot of this will be actually familiar from as you go around your own streets. It's more intensive development of existing sites. So you've just got more on what was a lightly used site. It's the reallocation of employment land. 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, local authorities were hanging on to land all over the country in the faint hope that the Korean investor would come up the motorway, turn off at their junction and build some sort of employment generating activity. That sort of silly hope has been damped down, and land has been reallocated to meet the rather more important need for housing land. Surface car parking. This is a country that is, if you compare it with our European neighbours, is expect to be able to park at grade in the heart of its towns and cities. You go to the centre of most, if you go to Reims, for example, you drive right into the centre of the town, right enough, you then disappear. You don't sit in the middle of prime urban land, pay your 20p and resent it like mad, which is my experience of most of southern England, and not use that land for anything else. And that is being played in. Redeveloping the housing itself, undoubtedly some sort of source. Intensification in the existing residential areas. That will be very familiar to anybody in London, as little sites are chipped off and built on, and sites that used to be underused garage courts. And then a category that planners call vacant white land, which is land that doesn't have any allocation but isn't actually a green space either. Pretty rare in most of the southeast now, but it does exist. So all these sources have been contributing and making a really important contribution. I'll come back to how we evaluate them. And then we have the sources that are actually more about change than about developing new land. The subdivision. I mean, subdivision of houses into flats is a steady source of growth. It's not huge, but it's a contribution. The conversion of office blocks into housing goes in waves. The two curves interact. When the office market's down and the housing market's on the rise, we convert like mad. But I'm old enough to remember working for Westminster City Council when the absolute obsession of these dreadful offices that were going to take over the whole of central London, now the poor office developers can barely hang on to them. So there are swings and roundabouts there, but that has tended to produce a lot of inner urban housing in our bigger cities over the last few years. And then the business that Peter's mentioned of empty houses being brought into use. All these things have really contributed, and it's important to recognize that they've contributed to new house building, to turning pressure away from the sorts of land use patterns we had 10, 15 years ago. And they've been possible because of the policy shift. It's very important. It isn't just that this capacity has suddenly come about. This capacity has been forced into use by intensity of policy, shifting the balance. And this is a diagram from the report that we've both mentioned, the Towards an Urban Renaissance, the last report, the main report of the Urban Task Force, which showed what had happened in retail floor space growth out of town, and then what, after the change in policy to tighten up on out of town and to promote inner town shopping, then happened to the ratio of out of town versus town centre openings. Policy matters. National policy matters. The out-of-town story shows it, and so does the proportion of development on previously developed land. Those things, it does actually matter what the policy context is. But what also matters is good practice. And we've recently done a report for, as it happens, the CPRE, that unbiased body. It's called Untapped Potential, and looked at some practice around the country. But we also did work for the London planners, sustainable residential quality, looking at where were the places where by changing policy and practice you could get good quality, more quantity and proper location near the high density potential, well-located places that Peter's talking about. We looked at Leeds, where over 90% of the housing is now on brownfield land. Swale, which is a district down in North Kent, really having a careful look at their car parking stock and getting land on it. Waveney in East Anglia, really concentrating on the small sites. Gravesham and Plymouth, really thinking hard about previous development land, and in the town and city centres there, linking it to their urban renaissance policies. So this is a study that was really examining the difference that good local practice can make, sitting in below the difference that good national policy can make. And we concluded, actually, that, well, capacity assessments, local authorities are doing quite a good job, but they are still underestimating the potential. And in particular, they're underestimating the small sites, which is where huge amounts of potential have been coming from. And we also concluded that if you've got these coherent policies, like some of the authorities we looked at, on previously developed land, on density, and on what you're trying to do with the place that you're creating, which I think was the point that Peter was making. This is not just about the numbers. This is about creating places that have, let's not get obsessed with density, they have intensity, and they have strong relationships so that people want to live there, and they have the services that go with them. Then you can get more development with good environment and good urban grain and feel as well. And some of the concerns we've touched on already. High density living. High density per se is not a problem. Kensington, around us, is one of the highest density places in London. It's one of the best off. And of course, it's, as Tony Feiston was saying to me earlier on, it's easier to live at high density if you're well off than if you're poor. But most things are easier when you're rich than when you're poor. Studies have shown, not mine. But high density, it's important not to get carried away. Higher than what is always the question. Britain's towns are, by and large, amongst the least dense in Europe. We've got quite a long way to go. We have half-empty towns in most of the rest of the country, apart from the southeast. Yes, there are too many small apartments. That's a product of the development economics that Simon was alluding to. This very odd pattern that we've got, that because housing is an investment, rather than primarily a thing to, or as well as, a thing to house people, the market is distorted by people's investment decisions. And that needs sorting out, but it isn't a reason for not trying to do brownfield development. Grabbing the gardens, well, this is an inner London development. Peter's already name-checked Patrick Clark, my business partner at Tribal, and this is his back garden in Forest Hill in inner London. This area is 35-40 to the hectare. It's what would have been considered dense 10, 15 years ago. If we could develop all our new places at this density, we would be doing extremely well. And grabbing the gardens has not been actually a very major feature. It's a big worry people have. Ooh, you're just going to build in all our back gardens. Actually, that is not one of the sources that really registers in our studies of what's happened over the last 10 years. The idea that we might run out of brownfield land, well, I don't know. Fords in Dagenham, huge, great site. When Fords decide that it'll be cheaper to do it in Czech Republic or the Philippines, it will be swift and it will be brutal, and that will be a housing site. That's how it goes. Nissan, you know, people say to me in Sunderland, you know, this is our new future. Well, when Nissan decide it, it's over. That's what brownfield land is. That new stock keeps coming up. Some of it, however, is in the wrong location. There's no doubt about that. That is a serious critique, and we'll see that in the ecotowns discussion. But it isn't just that land has been previously used. It's got to be somewhere useful. It's got to relate to the structures around it. And the key thing, I think, the key concern I have is that we don't just, as I said, follow the numbers game. It must be about urban renaissance. It must be about the creation of real places.
Could I finish soon, Martin?
Yep, a couple of minutes now. So my appeal would be, let's avoid the cartoon choices. It isn't just about the green belt or town cramming. Clearly, we're not going to need to meet all the demand on brownfield land, but we can meet over half of it, and in some places more than that. But that will leave a lot of greenfield development. That isn't invading the green belt to me. That's about making the right choices of place where you do greenfield, then doing it well, making these real urban places, not this sort of nowheresville new housing development on which, sadly, about half my rallies live and probably half yours. But, you know, we've got to take the brownfield potential really seriously, but use all the policy to achieve it. So I will just quickly look at this ecotowns business to conclude, because the government says they're going to be exemplar green developments. They could be anything between 5,000 to 20,000 homes, and they're going to be freestanding with their own facilities and well linked to nearby towns. Well, I'm not sure when you look at that map what towns some of those are linked to, but we, partly because some of them are, they're picked because they're old airfields, so they're not a function of urban planning, they're a function of defence planning of 70 years ago. But there's a really interesting piece of research that the late Mike Brainey and David Locke and a colleague did, probably 15 years ago, Peter, I should think, not nearly. But it was to look at what the forms might be for new development. And really they concluded that, yes, the 3,000 to 5,000 homes ones, and certainly not smaller than that, might be acceptable, but that environmental considerations, which are stronger now with the sustainability thrust, would point to schemes even larger. And that if sustainability is given greater weight, a scale of 10,000 dwellings could be the most desirable. So you're talking about places of the sort Peter was talking about, adding 30,000 homes before you're not actually saying you've got all these green boilers and all these water butts that eat dormice or whatever it is they do. And it doesn't matter because it's taking you so many pounds of carbon to drive to the bloody things that you might as well not have bothered. And I think that's the fundamental critique of the ecotown thing, that they come out of what I think of as the three Ps, the panic about housing numbers, leading to politics, and only belatedly ending up with planning. Their small scale counts against their sustainability. Quite a lot of them are a nice idea in the wrong place. Not all of them, but the nice idea in the wrong place syndrome is pretty strong. And actually, they're neither here nor there in terms of the big numbers that Peter was talking about. It's about how we do well the things that we've been doing already. So my last slide I just jumped through is, he's brought up in Blackpool and I was brought up in Wigan. And so I think our final appeal is actually, this is a very southern debate in many ways. This is the view from inside the M25 and just outside it. The rest of Britain, so, this is in the Take, by the way, it's lovely, you shall walk down, there it is. The view from the north is not the same as this enormous panic. The north wants development, it wants its towns reviving. We need a national policy about this, not a sort of lash up to solve the southeast problems in the short term. Thanks very much, sir.